On the 25th of December, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat down in front of a television camera inside the Kremlin, straightened his papers, and resigned from a job that no longer existed. The country he had been elected to lead, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the largest nation in human history by landmass, a nuclear superpower that had launched the first satellite into space, that had outlasted Hitler, that had matched America weapon for nearly half a century, had ceased to exist. Not through war, not through revolution, not through invasion. It had simply ended. And the part that no one talks about, the part that should keep you awake, is that almost nobody saw it coming. Not the CIA, not Western governments, not most Soviet citizens, not even, reportedly, Gorbachev himself. As late as the summer of 1991, analysts were publishing papers about the long-term stability of the Soviet bloc. Careers had been built on the assumption that the USSR was a permanent fixture of the world, a fact, like gravity, like the sun. And then, in what history books compress into a few decisive days, it was gone. So the question isn't just what happened. The question is something stranger and more unsettling than that. How does something that enormous, something that spans 11 time zones and controls the largest nuclear arsenal in history, how does it vanish so completely, so that the world barely had time to react? And more importantly, what was actually happening inside the machine in the years, months, and hours before that flag came down? Because the story you've been told is incomplete. The collapse of the Soviet Union isn't a story about communism failing. It isn't a story about America winning. It's a story about how systems rot from the inside while their surfaces remain perfectly intact. It's a story about information and lies, and the terrifying moment when a government loses the ability to pretend. It's a story about what happens when the gap between the official version of reality and actual reality becomes too wide to survive. To understand what ended, you have to understand what it was. At its height, the Soviet Union was not merely a country. It was an ideology made physical, a vast, engineered civilization stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing 15 republics, over 100 ethnic groups, and nearly 300 million people. It had its own calendar of holidays, its own cosmology of heroes, its own architecture designed to make the individual feel appropriately small. It had won the Second World War at a cost almost incomprehensible to the Western mind. Over 26 million Soviet citizens dead, entire cities reduced to ash. And it had emerged from that catastrophe, not broken, but galvanized, forged into something harder and more resolute than it had been before. By 1957, it had put a satellite into orbit. By 1961, it had put a man in space. By the early 1970s, it possessed enough nuclear warheads to destroy every major city on Earth several times over. On paper, it was everything it claimed to be: a superpower, a civilization, a historical force. But paper is the operative word, because running underneath the surface of all of that achievement was something the Soviet system had been generating since its earliest years, something it had been designed, almost architecturally, to produce. And that thing was a specific and peculiar kind of lie. Not the ordinary political lie, the kind that governments tell when they exaggerate or omit. Something more structural, more total. A lie that had become so embedded in the operating logic of the state that the people telling it had long since stopped being aware they were lying at all. The Soviet system ran on reported numbers. Production quotas, harvest figures, industrial output, military readiness. Every layer of the bureaucracy reported upward to the layer above it, and every layer had an overwhelming incentive to make those numbers look good. Factory managers who failed to meet their quotas didn't get bonuses docked. They got careers ended, sometimes more than careers. So the numbers went up. They always went up. Output figures climbed year after year in the official records, even as the shelves in Soviet shops became emptier, even as the roads crumbled, even as the machinery aged and rusted and failed. By the 1970s, the Soviet government was, in a very real sense, governing a country that existed primarily in its own data. The real country, the one where people actually lived, where bread was rationed and apartments went unheated and children were taught in schools that had no textbooks. That country was an open secret, acknowledged in whispers and black market transactions, and the thousand small adaptations people make when the official system stops functioning. The word for this, in Soviet slang, was blot, the network of favors, connections, unofficial arrangements that actually moved resources through a society that had officially abolished the market. It was the country's shadow operating system, and by the late Brezhnev era, the period Soviet historians would later call the epoch of stagnation, the shadow system had become, in many ways, more real than the official one. Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary from 1964 until his death in 1982, presided over this slow freezing with the serene confidence of a man who had internalized the official version so completely that the divergence had become invisible to him. His government maintained the performance of Soviet strength while the underlying reality quietly deteriorated. GDP growth rates that the state reported at 5 or 6% were, according to later analysis, probably closer to 1 or 2, and may have been negative in some years. Military spending consumed somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire Soviet economy, a proportion so extreme that the civilian infrastructure was being systematically cannibalized to maintain it. The empire was eating itself, and it had been doing so, quietly, for decades, before anything visible broke. But systems can sustain internal decay for a very long time if the pressure never finds an exit. What the Soviet Union needed, what every closed, self-mythologizing system needs in order to begin unraveling, was a moment when the lie became undeniable. When the gap between the official version and the real version became impossible to paper over. That moment arrived at 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, in a place called Pripyat, Ukraine. The explosion at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was, in purely physical terms, a catastrophe. 2 blasts in rapid succession that blew the reactor's 1,000-ton lid into the air and released 400 times the radiation of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In the hours immediately following, a supervisor was asked to measure radiation levels near the reactor core. His dosimeter, the highest reading instrument available, maxed out at 3.6 Röntgen per hour. That was technically within manageable limits. The number was reported upward. The word spread that the situation, while serious, was under control. The actual radiation level at the core was 15,000 Röntgen per hour. A lethal dose for an unprotected human takes roughly 4 seconds at that exposure. The supervisor's dosimeter hadn't been malfunctioning. It had simply reached the top of its range and stopped. The system had literally no instrument capable of reading reality as it actually was. For the next 36 hours, Soviet officials maintained, publicly, that a minor accident had occurred and was being managed. They did not evacuate Pripyat, a city of 50,000 people located 2 kilometers from the reactor, for over a day and a half. When Swedish radiation monitors began detecting elevated readings and traced the source to Soviet territory, Moscow continued to deny anything significant had occurred. It took international pressure, the threat of global embarrassment, and the private council of scientists who were no longer willing to lie about what they were seeing before the official narrative began to crack. Gorbachev would later say that Chernobyl was the real beginning of the end, not because of the radiation, but because of what it revealed about the system. The plant had been certified as safe by engineers who knew it wasn't. The initial reports had been falsified by officials who understood the culture of their superiors. The evacuation had been delayed by a bureaucratic reflex toward minimization that had been institutionally trained over generations. The disaster wasn't an accident that happened to occur in the Soviet Union. It was a product of the Soviet Union, of exactly the system that had been generating falsified production figures and suppressed agricultural failures for 60 years. Chernobyl was what happened when that system collided with physics, which has no incentive to cooperate with the official version. And something cracked in the public consciousness. Not immediately, not visibly, but a question entered the air that had not been there before, or had not been asked quite so loudly. If they lied about this, if the reactors they told us were the safest in the world were actually catastrophically dangerous, what else have they been lying about? Mikhail Gorbachev understood, or believed he understood, what was necessary. He was, by Soviet standards, a reformer, a man shaped by the system but genuinely troubled by its failures, genuinely convinced that the Union could be saved if the pathologies could be excised. His two famous programs, Glasnost and Perestroika, openness and restructuring, were not intended to dismantle the Soviet state. They were intended to modernize it, to introduce enough transparency to expose the corruption and enough economic flexibility to repair the stagnation. What Gorbachev failed to understand, what may have been impossible to understand from inside the system, was that the Soviet state was not a structure with a few bad parts that could be removed while the rest continued to function. It was an organism in which the pathologies had become load-bearing. The lies were structural. The corruption was the mechanism. The falsified numbers were not a bug in the operating system. They were the operating system. When he opened the valves of Glasnost, what came out was not a manageable stream of constructive criticism that could be channeled into reform. What came out was 70 years of suppressed reality, all at once. Newspapers that had printed only what the state approved began printing testimony about the Gulag. Historians who had written only what the state sanctioned began publishing evidence of the famine years, the Holodomor, the Ukrainian death toll that the state had classified for decades. Citizens who had performed loyalty for their entire lives suddenly found themselves in a public square where it was, if not exactly safe, then at least less dangerous than before, to say what they actually thought. And what they actually thought was not, as it turned out, an endorsement of the Soviet project. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, something extraordinary happened. People held hands. Literally. On August 23, 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the secret agreement between Stalin and Hitler that had delivered the Baltic nations into Soviet control, approximately 2 million people formed a human chain stretching 675 kilometers across all three countries. They called it the Baltic Way. It was a demand for independence, expressed not through violence, but through the sheer physical fact of linked hands across a landscape. Moscow's response was what you'd expect from a system that had not yet absorbed the implications of Glasnost. A communiqué condemning the action as nationalist extremism, insisting on the historical legitimacy of Soviet authority in the region, demanding that order be maintained. No one listened. No one was afraid anymore. Or rather, and this is the crucial distinction, enough people had collectively decided to stop performing their fear that the performance had broken down entirely. And a state that rules by performed fear has very few options when the performance ends. By 1990, the Soviet economy was not merely stagnating, it was in free fall. There is a number that does not appear in most textbooks about this period, a number that explains more about the collapse than almost any political analysis. In 1986, the price of oil on the world market dropped by 50%. The Soviet Union's hard currency revenue, the dollars and Deutschmarks it needed to purchase Western technology, to service its foreign debt, to maintain even the illusion of economic competitiveness, was derived primarily from oil exports. The Soviet economy had been quietly dependent on high oil prices since the 1970s, when the OPEC crisis had temporarily made Russian crude extremely valuable on the world market. That windfall had masked the fundamental dysfunction of the planned economy, had subsidized the military buildup, had allowed Brezhnev's government to maintain living standards just high enough to prevent open revolt. When the price collapsed, the subsidy disappeared. The underlying reality of the Soviet economy, the true productivity figures, the real state of the industrial base, the genuine purchasing power of the ruble, was suddenly exposed, like a tide going out. The shelves didn't just become empty, the supply chains began to disintegrate. Entire sectors of the economy that had functioned on state credit found that credit evaporating. Inflation, which the Soviet system had technically abolished by controlling all prices, began manifesting anyway in the black market, and in the lengthening queues, and in the quiet, grinding daily humiliation of a population that could no longer that the most basic goods would be available tomorrow. Gorbachev tried to restructure. He reduced subsidies to state enterprises that were losing money. The effect was predictable in retrospect, though apparently not to the reformers. Enterprises that had been surviving on subsidies while producing things no one actually wanted simply shut down, adding unemployment to an economy that had officially abolished unemployment and therefore had no system for dealing with it. He tried to decentralize. Regional governments, suddenly given more authority, began making decisions in the interests of their regions rather than the Union. Republics that had been integrated into a planned economy began establishing border controls, restricting the movement of goods, acting, tentatively, incrementally, like sovereign states. Every reform intended to save the Union accelerated its dissolution. It was as if the structure had been held together not by strength but by pressure, and the moment anyone released the pressure, the whole thing began to expand outward uncontrollably. But there is a moment, a specific, datable, almost absurdly dramatic moment, when the collapse shifted from gradual to catastrophic. And it happened not because of economics or demographics or the cumulative weight of historical failure. It happened because a group of men made a decision that they were absolutely certain would save the Union, and in making it, destroyed the last thing holding it together. On the morning of August 19, 1991, Soviet citizens woke up to find that Mikhail Gorbachev had been removed from power. The state television channels, all of them, were broadcasting Swan Lake. This was, in the Soviet cultural vocabulary, a signal as legible as a fire alarm. Swan Lake played on all channels meant something had happened to the leadership. It had played when Brezhnev died. It had played when Andropov died. It had played when Chernenko died. The population understood immediately, before any announcement, that the world had changed overnight. What had happened was a coup. The State Committee for the State of Emergency, a committee that had essentially constituted itself, had placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation dacha in Crimea, had surrounded the building with forces loyal to the conspirators, and had announced that for reasons of health, the General Secretary was temporarily unable to perform his duties. Power had been transferred, the announcement explained, to Vice President Gennady Yanayev. The men behind the coup were, in a sense, the last true believers. They were KGB Chairman Vladimir Kryuchkov, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov, and several others, senior figures of the Soviet state who had watched Gorbachev's reforms with mounting horror and had concluded, not entirely without reason, that the Union was being dismantled piece by piece and that only a restoration of order, Soviet order, could stop the slide. They had tanks, they had troops, they had control of the television stations, they had, by any conventional measure of power, every advantage that had always been sufficient to maintain Soviet authority. They had not, apparently, fully accounted for Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin, who had been elected president of the Russian Federation in June, who had been a thorn in Gorbachev's side for years, who was many things, but never a man who retreated, climbed onto a tank outside the Russian Parliament building, the White House, and spoke to the crowd gathered in the street below. He declared the coup illegal. He called for a general strike. He invited the soldiers surrounding him to consider which side of history they wanted to be on. The soldiers did not fire. And then something happened that the architects of the coup had simply not modeled into their planning. People came out. Not thousands. Tens of thousands. Ordinary Muscovites who had never participated in anything overtly political in their lives, who had spent decades performing compliance, showed up in front of the Parliament building and formed a human wall. They came with whatever they had: umbrellas, thermoses of tea, the physical fact of their bodies. Doctors and students and factory workers standing in the rain, deciding, collectively, that the performance was over. The coup collapsed in 72 hours. Not because the military didn't have the capability, not because the conspirators ran out of options in any purely tactical sense. It collapsed because, and this is the thing that reveals everything about what the Soviet Union had actually become, enough people were willing to kill for it anymore. The soldiers didn't fire. The pilots ordered to attack the Parliament building filed their flight plans and then sat on the tarmac. Unit commanders received orders and found reasons to delay, to request clarification, to wait for confirmation that never came. An empire built on the credible threat of violence discovered, in the streets of Moscow in August 1991, that the credibility had evaporated. The coup leaders, who had expected the population to react as Soviet populations had always reacted, with quiet, fearful compliance, had not understood that the population they were attempting to govern no longer existed. The Glasnost years had created something new, something the system had never intended to create, a citizenry with a public memory of its own grievances, a population that had been allowed to say true things long enough to begin believing that the truth had weight. 3 men died at the barricades. The plotters were arrested. Gorbachev returned from Crimea, visibly shaken, older somehow than he had been 3 days before. He had survived, but what he had survived was a ghost war, a battle over something that was no longer there. What followed the failed coup moved at a speed that even the participants seemed to find disorienting. The Baltic states had been edging toward independence for years. After August 19, they simply declared it. Estonia on August 20th, while the coup was still in progress. Latvia on August 21st. Lithuania had already declared independence in 1990 and had been holding it by nerve and international attention against Soviet pressure. Now the pressure was gone. The recognition followed within days from country after country, the United States, the European community, eventually the Soviet Union itself, then the other republics. Ukraine on August 24th, Belarus, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Turkmenistan, each declaration arriving like an echo of the one before it, the Union dissolving not in a single dramatic moment, but in a cascade, a self-reinforcing sequence of departures, each one making the next more inevitable. Gorbachev spent the autumn trying to negotiate some form of voluntary union, a confederation, a partnership, anything with the word union in the title that might preserve some functional continuity of the Soviet project. He shuttled between republic leaders. He proposed frameworks. He genuinely believed, it seems, that even now the Union could be salvaged in some form. And then 3 men drove to a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest. On December 8, 1991, Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Stanislaw Shushkevich of Belarus met in secret at a state hunting facility in what is now Western Belarus. They had come, officially, to discuss economic cooperation. What they decided to do was rather more significant than that. They signed a document declaring that the Soviet Union as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality had ceased to exist. In its place, they established the Commonwealth of Independent States, a loose framework for the former Soviet republics to maintain certain practical relationships without any overarching political union. The legal reasoning they deployed was remarkable in its audacity. The 3 men argued that since Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were the original signatories of the 1922 treaty that had created the Soviet Union, they had the inherent authority to dissolve it. They were, in effect, claiming to uncreate the state by reversing the act of its creation. Whether this argument holds up to rigorous legal scrutiny is a question that has kept international lawyers occupied ever since. But in December 1991, legal scrutiny was not the governing force in the situation. Power was, and the power, by that point, had already moved. Yeltsin reportedly called President George H.W. Bush before calling Gorbachev. Let that detail sit for a moment. The leader of Russia informed the President of the United States that the Soviet Union no longer existed before informing the leader of the Soviet Union. When Gorbachev finally learned what had been signed in the forest, he was furious. He called the decision illegal. He called it a coup, which, in a sense, it was, though a constitutional one, or at least a constitutionally flavored one. But the window in which his fury could change anything had already closed. The republics recognized the Commonwealth. The international community began adjusting its recognition accordingly. The apparatus of Soviet power, the ministries, the military commands, the diplomatic missions, began the bureaucratic process of transferring to new national authorities. There was nothing left to govern. On the evening of December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev delivered his resignation address. He was 60 years old. He had come from peasant stock, from a village in the Stavropol region, had risen through the Soviet system on intelligence and ambition, and an unusual capacity for genuine reflection. He had wanted to save the Union. He had been certain, for most of his tenure, that he could. He sat in front of the camera, and he spoke for 11 minutes. He said that he had been guided by historical necessity. He said the society had been liberated, politically and spiritually. He said he was leaving with worry, but also with hope. He did not cry. When he finished speaking, he signed the documents transferring control of the Soviet nuclear arsenal to the president of Russia. Then he rose from his chair and left the room. Within the hour, the Soviet flag, the red banner with the hammer and sickle, which had flown over the Kremlin since 1922, was lowered from the flagpole above the Senate building. The Russian tricolor was raised in its place. The entire ceremony took a few minutes. There was no crowd. There were a handful of military officers and Kremlin staff. The cameras were there because the cameras were always there. But this was not a staged event, not a performance designed for public consumption. It was more like a formality, the official registration of something that had already happened. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which had existed for 69 years, which had survived civil war and famine and the most destructive conflict in human history, which had built nuclear weapons and orbital satellites and a state ideology that had inspired revolutions on 5 continents, ceased to exist at approximately 7:32 in the evening, Moscow time, December 25, 1991. Christmas Day. Here is the thing that should unsettle you, if it doesn't already. The Soviet Union's collapse was not predicted, not with any meaningful precision, by anyone with access to the relevant information. The CIA, the most lavishly funded intelligence organization in the history of the world, with decades of institutional focus on the Soviet threat, with thousands of analysts and assets and intercepts and satellites trained on exactly this question, did not predict it. The agency's assessments through the late 1980s consistently treated Soviet collapse as a distant, theoretical possibility, not an imminent reality. This is not a criticism of the CIA specifically. Every serious analytical body that tracked the Soviet Union made essentially the same error. Academic Sovietology, the entire academic field dedicated to studying the system, was largely caught off guard. The political science literature of the 1980s is full of confident analyses of Soviet stability. Why? How? Part of the answer is that the system was designed to be unreadable from outside. The falsification of data that had been the operating logic of Soviet governance for decades meant that external analysts were working with information that had been systematically corrupted at the source. The economic statistics were wrong. The production figures were wrong. The assessments of military readiness were wrong. Anyone trying to analyze the Soviet Union from its official outputs was analyzing a fiction, and had been for so long that many had forgotten to question whether the inputs were real. But here is the deeper, more disturbing part. The analysts were not only misled by false data, they were misled by a cognitive bias that all observers carry, the assumption that what has persisted will continue to persist. The Soviet Union had survived everything. It had survived Stalin's purges, which killed the people most capable of running it. It had survived Hitler's invasion, which killed millions and destroyed much of its Western industrial base. It had survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Chinese split, Afghanistan, Solidarity. Every crisis had been managed, absorbed, survived. The pattern was crisis, survival. So the pattern would continue. Crisis, survival. The system would adapt, as it always had adapted. The collapse was unthinkable not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the evidence had never before produced collapse. Until it did. There is a question that historians still argue about, and that the evidence cannot fully resolve. Did the Soviet Union collapse because it had to, or because of choices made by particular individuals at particular moments who could have chosen differently? Was Gorbachev's Glasnost the proximate cause, a well-intentioned reform that fatally miscalculated the pressures it was releasing? Or was the system already too far gone that no reform strategy could have saved it, and Glasnost merely determined the timing and character of an inevitable end? Was the August coup the decisive event, the moment that destroyed whatever remaining legitimacy the central government possessed? Or was the coup itself a symptom of a deeper dysfunction, a desperate action by men who sensed, correctly, that time had already run out? Were the 3 men in the Belovezha forest making history, or ratifying it? The honest answer is that complex systems don't yield to clean causation. The Soviet Union collapsed because of the oil price crash, and because of the Afghan war, and because of Chernobyl, and because of the falsified data, and because of Gorbachev's reforms, and because of Yeltsin's ambition, and because the Baltic peoples held hands across 675 kilometers, and because the soldiers didn't fire. It collapsed because of choices made in 1922, and 1932, and 1953, and 1986, and 1991. It collapsed slowly, and then all at once. What the speed of the final collapse reveals is not that the system was weak, it's that the system had been operating for decades on borrowed time, sustained by a combination of genuine capability and systematic self-deception, and that when the self-deception became unsustainable, the genuine capability was no longer sufficient to compensate. This is not a lesson that belongs only to the Soviet Union. Every large system, political, corporate, institutional, develops over time an interest in maintaining its own official story about itself. The gap between the official story and the reality tends to grow slowly, invisibly, managed by the people who benefit from the gap. The growth is gradual enough that each generation of stewards inherits a system that has always worked this way, that has always required this particular willful blindness. And who am I to question what has always worked this way? And then something changes. A price collapses, or a reactor explodes, or a wave of soldiers decides not to shoot, or 3 men meet in a forest and sign a document. And the official story, which has been load-bearing all along, fails. And the speed of what follows is shocking only to those who had not looked carefully at what was holding it up. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, though it has the texture of something real, about a Soviet economist named Nikolai Shmelev, who in the late 1980s published an article in a prominent Soviet literary magazine that was, for its time, remarkably candid about the state of the Soviet economy. He wrote that the country was not, as the official statistics insisted, continuing to grow. It was declining. The infrastructure was deteriorating. The people were demoralized. The system was not fixable through cosmetic adjustments. The article generated an enormous response. Readers wrote letters. Party officials demanded his censure. Gorbachev, reportedly, read it and did not have him arrested, which was itself a signal of how much had changed. What Shmelev had done was simple, in principle. He had published the real numbers. He had said, in a public forum, a thing that very many people privately knew to be true, but that no official voice had yet said in public. And the response, the anger, the fear, the desperate insistence by some that he was lying, that the official figures were correct, tells you everything about how deeply the official story had been internalized, how much had been invested in it, how catastrophic it felt to those who believed it for the story to be challenged. The Union had not been held together by tanks alone. It had been held together by a shared performance of belief, a collective agreement to act as if the official story were true. And the moment enough people stopped performing, the tanks were not sufficient. This is why the collapse happened when it did, and with the particular texture it had. Not a military defeat, not a revolution, not exactly. More like a collective exhalation, more like a country reaching the end of its own endurance for a particular kind of pretending. Mikhail Gorbachev understood this, somewhere in his bones, even if he never fully articulated it. He had tried to close the gap between the official story and reality, gradually enough that the system could survive the adjustment. He had tried to control the revelation. But revelations, once started, do not ask permission to continue. The flag came down on Christmas Day. The cameras recorded it. And somewhere, in the cold Moscow evening, 300 million people began the uncertain, necessary, exhausting work of finding out who they were when they were no longer Soviet. Nobody had an answer ready, because the system that had told them who they were had only ever told them a story. And stories, it turns out, can end.